Welcome, everybody. Hi, welcome to today's event. I am Tim Lorden, and I'm with a relatively new organization called the Decentralized Future Council. It's a project of ours, the Internet Education Foundation, to kind of put a sharper pencil on some of the policy issues around the emerging decentralized web. And we're just relatively new, been around for like less than a year. The council, the Decentralized Future Council, focuses on policy in the decentralized web space, basically beyond Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies are really not our focus. Our focus is the larger ecosystem of decentralized technologies. Like, for instance, you won't see us doing a briefing in the future on FTX and Binance. That's probably not what we're going to be doing at all. And we do this with the help of the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. They're great partners of ours. And today's event is looking at decentralized domain names. What does the DNS look like in Web3? For the type of work that we do, and this is very similar to the work that we did in the 1990s with the Congressional Internet Caucus and the State of the Net Conference, is kind of have to explain a little bit about what these new technologies are. And so 93. Now, we used to have to explain why, the internet packet switching was different from broadcast and cable television. And we kind of have to do a little bit of the same thing here. So there's some foundational things that we have to put down. So just bear with us a little bit. Most people either on this call or on this webinar are very knowledgeable about the DNS, and some are very knowledgeable about the decentralized web and domain addressing there. But so we might have different disciplines here, but we have a great panel of experts that know a lot about both. So let me just kind of start by explaining like what we think the decentralized web, or sometimes people call it Web3, what we think it is. And we kind of think of it as a larger ecosystem of decentralized technologies that include blockchains, tokens, smart contracts, and we're really interested in like building the way that developers are building new services and things like that really will make the internet a better place. And that's kind of our hope. And we're not an advocacy organization, we're not a think tank or anything like that, but we try to kind of have conversations about these issues. So just to start off with, obviously the domain name system has existed for a very long time. It used to be run literally by people, sometimes people refer to him as the god of the internet. His name is John Postel, who passed away some time ago. And he kind of ran what we know as the domain name system. And ultimately, the Department of Commerce and kind of moved that function over to ICANN, which is called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Its governance is complicated. It's a multi-stakeholder organization. And everybody has a say. It allowed for kind of the scale of the internet as we know it when it comes to registering domain names and making those names friendly, and the stability of it. So, but I'm not going to go into a long conversation about what ICANN is, and we're fortunate to have a representative from ICANN here. When it comes to kind of addressing, and it comes to blockchains and decentralized technology, the same way with the DNS, where like Xerox.com is actually the human readable friendly version of a list of IP addresses that go to a particular server. It's kind of the same way when it comes to decentralized web technologies. The content that is stored on the decentralized web often has a long string of numbers that are even less friendly from a human readable perspective than domain names. And it's the same with crypto wallets, where you have keys or long strings of numbers, not very human friendly readable. So people obviously want to make more human readable versions of that, right? So that's what we're starting to see, a lot of what we call domain or alternative addressing schemes coming out when it comes to cryptocurrencies, decentralized web technologies. There's a lot of them, and not the least of which are ENS, Handshake, Unstoppable Domains, and even to a certain extent, the Interplanetary File System, IPFS, from Filecoin or Protocol Labs is kind of an addressing related different. Everybody's starting to do a lot of registrations for these domains, and as it was at the early days of the internet, there's a lot of it's burgeoning controversy. Last spring, a member of the Internet Law and Policy Foundry mentioned to me that the principal technologist of ICANN had written a document just laying some of the challenges out when it comes to all of these different addressing schemes. And you may have seen them on your Twitter feed. Like some people put in their Twitter handle .etf, .eth, which is Ethereum. You'll see other things like there was a couple of coins. And then now there's a couple of wallets, and there's just a lot of different addressing schemes. And what we wanted to talk today about, like, what happens, like who runs this? How do these things get registered? Is there an ICANN version of this in the decentralized web, or is this the responsibility of ICANN and government officials to bring some order here? I don't know. And how does it interact with existing law like trademark and copyright, and how do you deal with some of those things? So in the past several months, there's been some crazy things since I read that paper back in April. There's a lot of developments in the space. Giovanna just mentioned to me that at the Web Summit back in Lisbon a few weeks ago, even last week, there was a domain alliance announced, and I don't even know much about that. So all of this stuff is really new, really exciting. And we have a great panel of speakers to kind of talk to us today about that. So let me just see if I can introduce them and not screw it up. The speakers that we have today are, our first speaker is Alain Durand. Durand. He is the principal technologist for ICANN, and his name was the inspiration for, his last name was the inspiration for the mega 80s rock band Durand. I don't know if anybody knows that, but it's absolutely true. We also have Chjango Unchained. She's the executive director of the dWeb Foundation and head of ecosystem at Cosmos Networks. And we're super excited to have Chjango with us today, because one of the things that we didn't do very well as an organization in the 1990s was getting people actually developing technologies on the internet to actually come to Washington and speak with policymakers. So I'm super grateful for that. And considering it's very early in the morning where Chjango is, I'm super appreciative. We also have Giovanna Fessenden, who's counsel at Hamilton, Brock, Smith, and Reynolds. She's an IP attorney in the Massachusetts area. And Tom Barrett, who's president of EnCirca. And Tom has a lot of different other titles. Chjango has a lot of different titles, but they're real experts in this area. So let me just start with Alain. Alain, I read your paper. It was called Challenges with Alternative Addressing. It is fascinating, and we'll share this on Twitter at our Twitter handle, which is down in the left-hand corner. Can you just kind of start us off by just talking about what are the challenges when it comes to alternative addressing in the decentralized web as we know it?
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for having me. Maybe I will share my screen and have a couple of slides that will help me to.
I think I'm sure.
Oh, no, yeah. Okay. Perfect. So please move on to the next slide. All right. So I wrote a paper earlier this year. It was a follow-up to a blog post that I made at the very beginning of the year. That was called Buyer Beware. And this is when we started to hear a lot about those alternative names coming on the market. The goal of my paper was to really document some of the technical challenges that people will face when those things get deployed. And by people, I don't necessarily mean people buying those names and trying to use them. I mean people like you and me who are on the other side, and that might be impacted one way or another by the mere existence of those names. The non-goal was to talk about what is the governance model of all those different organizations. This is an important topic, but I'm part of the ICANN office of the CTO. It's a technical organization looking at technologies. So we decided that we should focus on the technology aspect of it and let other people dive deeper into the governance models of the different organizations. There's a link here to my paper. I'm sure the team will share it later. Next slide, please. So background, alternative naming systems. This is nothing new. Actually, that even predates the existence of ICANN. Back in the early 2000s, late 1990s, there were a number of alternate routes that were proposed. and each of them has their own namespace. And there was a potential for chaos with those different roots existing. And that led to a publication of an ICANN document called ICP3 in 2001. And I will come back to this document later. But they essentially was saying, well, there's value, there's real value in having a unique root. And that has created essentially what we have called the one world, one internet, that has been the foundation of the success of this technology and of this industry in the last 20-something years. So why now? Well, the popularity of blockchain in general, and so has been bringing attention to blockchain-based naming system. And there are a number of them. Tim talked about Handshake, DNS, unstoppable domains. It seems that every few more weeks a new one is coming. Next. Another thing is we're starting to see some ICANN accredited registrars selling domain names on those technology alongside to DNS domain names. And that had the potential to create some customer confusion, and that led to me writing this blog, Buyer Beware, at the very beginning of the year. Next, please. So when you're deploying those alternative namespace, if you're doing with a name that you're buying and you're creating your own environment with it, is technical challenges, but that's fairly easy to do. The question is, how can internet user resolve those names? And how can they reach you? So you can build applications for them using some dedicated libraries. And there are a number of libraries existing for different programming languages on the market. Or what about legacy applications? Well, bridging techniques do exist. I will not go into details with all of them, but it's possible to bridge the old world to the new world. Most of those bridging techniques require some kind of manual intervention. And that doesn't scale well beyond the early adopter enthusiast stage. In the end, if you want people to reach you, you will have to not only tell them what is your name, but you will have to tell them how to get to you, which tool to use, which extension to install. And that somehow raise the bar seriously. Next slide, please. When you use those bridges are not going to be deployed uniformly across the internet. And that can create some instability. For example, when I'm at home, which I'm today, I'm using my connection, and I'm in the Alps, and I'm lucky enough now in the last few weeks to have a fiber connection to my house. So right now I'm using fiber, but in some parts of my house, the Wi-Fi coverage is not very good, and I'm using cellular. If my cellular provider use a different bridge to this alternate namespace than the fiber provider, or one of them use a bridge and the other one does not, then depending on where I am in the house, I'm not going to have the same resolution. And that's a bit of a problem. This will lead to support calls to service providers and frustration. So next, please. So that was a challenge when you have one alternative namespace alongside the DNS, but what about multiple alternative namespace? As I said at the beginning, and as Tim mentioned earlier in this conversation, there are multiple alternative domain names that are now offering domains. Those are not coordinated. There's no community-driven coordination, neither between those alternative namespace, nor between those and the DNS. And because there is no community-driven coordination, then name collisions will be unavoidable. So a naive approach to this is to say, well, there are more namespace to choose from. So if I cannot get the name I want somewhere, I will get it in another namespace. Great. But how do users reach you? Well, I tell them to use this particular app. Well, application can only connect to one namespace at a time. So again, as my example with my house having several different coverage with either cellular or Wi-Fi, this will lead to unstable and unpredictable name resolution. And that is really the problem. So next, please. going to accelerate a little bit on this. This lack of coordination presents a serious risk of fragmentation of the internet with separate ecosystem. And that's really the main point I wanted to drive today.
And Alain, we've been doing briefings for at least a dozen years for traditional internet policy communities about the potential of a splinternet or internet fragmentation. It's a big topic in internet governance circles. But this actually, from a technical perspective, presents, maybe that manifestation of that risk. Can you? We already have a question in the chat about asking you to explain what is a blockchain-based domain name. Like, how can you have two different .wallets, like, for instance?
So you mentioned earlier, humans, they don't like numbers. They like names. If my name will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, nobody will remember. If my name is Alain, well, it's more likely that somebody will remember who I am. So there has to be a process to somehow map those names into something that is meaningful to the applications. What is meaningful to a blockchain-based application is essentially a pointer handle to some kind of a block somewhere in the chain. What is useful to a web browser is an IP address. So this mapping could have been done in the DNS for any kind of application. You could, for blockchain application, create an extension to the DNS to map a name to the actual crypto address of the wallet. Blockchain supporters decided to not go that route, but instead decided to implement their own mechanism to do this resolution inside of a blockchain, and to do that, create their own namespace that is different from the namespace we use on the internet. And that is the root cause of the issue.
So thank you for that kind of overview on the challenges. Chjango, I'd like to go to you, and you've kind of been involved in the development of Handshake, which is one of the decentralized web naming technologies. Can you kind of give the people here kind of like a sense of what Handshake is? How do these technologies work when it comes to naming as a substitute for like a wallet or for content on a blockchain?
Sure. And just to emphasize, the Handshake is differentiated from other naming projects because Handshake actually does resolve on DNS. And just like Alain said, the other naming projects like ENS and Unstoppable Domains and every other copy of ENS essentially is just appending a human readable name to a wallet address, which means that it only works within their ecosystem, and it's specialized for Ethereum, for example. So ENS names are human readable names for transacting within the Ethereum ecosystem specifically. So the way that you could think about that is Ethereum is on Mars, and they have no bridge to get back to Earth, where Earth is ICANN DNS, and Handshake is more like a rocket ship that sends messages back and forth. So Handshake is really the bridge that works for both ecosystems. Because right now, if you look at the state of Web3 domain names in the blockchain space, they are all operating in Mars with no means to get back to Earth. And so the model that a lot of projects like Unstoppable Domains has taken is to do Web3 domain names on Mars, but just try to build their way back to Earth and hope that they could spend enough money so that Earth will enforce its ICANN rules for Mars without Mars paying the cost of actually building any ship for speaking back and forth between the two. And that's really the biggest differentiator, I would say, between those projects that are building in this sort of meta internet compared to the internet that works today that we call Web 2.
That's great. And that's a great metaphor and analogy. Thank you so much.
I can chime in a little
please.
bit just to give some clarity. So, in the blockchain space, there are so many different types of blockchains, and they're not compatible with each other. So you have Ethereum as one blockchain. Bitcoin is the most famous kind of blockchain. It doesn't have these kind of, the blockchain domains are an NFT. They're not actually a domain name. They are a non-fungible token. And Bitcoin isn't set up to handle those kinds of things. And, NFTs are quite, a great innovation that's on the Ethereum platform. And they're just like the internet, there's many layers of Ethereum. So there's like the layer 1, which is the Ethereum blockchain. And then on top of that, there's many other different types of blockchains that are their own entities. So there's one blockchain called Polygon, which is what Unstoppable domain. So that Unstoppable is a blockchain domain name provider. And Polygon, so any Web3 interface, which could be a browser like Opera. Opera is a browser that enables you to look at Web3. And right now it's not a graphical user interface. It's really, it's mostly just text that you can see when you're looking at the blockchain. It's unlike Web3, Web2, which is our normal internet, which is graphical. It's much more interactive. Web3, the blockchain interface, is more transactional. It just shows you, what all of these NFTs and tokens and who owns them. And the idea behind when you have ownership of a token on the blockchain that's recorded there, as Alain mentioned, that it's quite, a series, your wallet address, it maps it to your wallet address, and it's a series of numbers and letters, and it's quite a long string. And the idea with the domain name NFTs for Web3 is to replace that long string with like an easy name. So like I have Giovanna Tech .nft. So anybody can take my domain name, if my blockchain domain, and send me money. I can request money from others using my cryptocurrency wallet. You can interface and do transactions, all over the world through your wallet. And eventually, in the future, we'll all be using our wallets to interface, throughout the doing transactions and mapping it to our websites and for all sorts of different functionality. It's like we're just sort of at the tip of the iceberg of what we can do with these NFTs.
So hope that's kind of clear. I think it's really it's super complicated, and I'm not an expert by any means, but I'm glad we have some experts on. I guess the next question is, Chjango, how does this universe of planets and rocket ships ultimately, or do they ultimately interface with the domain name service and ICANN and the IANA function? And I think I should mention that Alain from ICANN is not going to be commenting on ICANN policy. He's their principal technologist, and he's here to explain how a lot of this stuff works. But I'm not going to put him on the spot by asking him to comment on policy. How does it work? How does it interface? Or will it interface with the DNS at some point?
So what Giovanna had alluded to is absolutely correct, in that these blockchain domain names are strictly, they're toys, right? So all except Handshake. So we have done a disservice for people from the outside looking into the space by calling these things domain names, because again, what they've done is created human readable names and appended them or associated them with, hex strings, 0x, this, that, this. And the only way that they could connect it back to like traditional domains is by making that a subdomain on like a.eth. So, and short of integrations from browsers and everything, linking it back to traditional DNS, they don't actually resolve in DNS. Well, except for .eth. So here's the thing. If you have Unstoppable, projects that copy the Unstoppable model really don't resolve in DNS or speak in any way, shape, or form on the people on Earth who are using traditional DNS. And these people call it Web3 domains. I think the nomenclature is wrong, and it makes it confusing because that lends itself to saying that, okay, we didn't do any of the work to connect back to DNS, but we're going to call ourselves a top level domain and create all of these name collisions, which is why I think that there is a role for ICANN in this world to continue being the name conflict resolver, because you already have established processes in place to be able to effectively do that. And that means that you guys have to create a line in the sand, which is, okay, if it doesn't resolve in traditional DNS, maybe it doesn't count, right? So there are people in blockchain domain name space who are more, I guess, honest about what it is that they're building. And they're saying, okay, well, I'm going to have a .cosmos or a .sol or a .dot for Polkadot. And these names are strictly specific to transferring value between this specific ecosystem. And by this specific ecosystem, I mean, if I have a .cosmos, well, then you know that this is specific to the Cosmos blockchain. Or if I have a .eth, that these names are specifically for transferring money across these names and the Ethereum blockchain. So that's really what those things are. And it's a completely different conversation from Handshake, where it actually does create an alternative root zone that augments what ICANN has. So that's the distinction right there. And right now, what I'm hearing from everyone here is that there's a conflation of the two. And we really need to do a lot of education to help people understand that these two are completely different and not in the same ballpark.
Right. So unlike in the traditional web, where you have like a universal resource locator, like a URL, where there's just one that maps to a specific site, one, that often is a domain name, it's your URL. There's no universal URL in the blockchain space in Web3 at this time, because it's so fractured. There's so many different blockchains, and they're not centralized in communicating with each other. There's one predominant entity, which is Ethereum namespace, and they're issuing blockchain domains, and those are accepted by like all the standard browsers. So they seem to have the most acceptance. And then you have outfits like Unstoppable issuing their own domains, but it's not integrated yet in the browsers. The browsers are not you have to plug in an extension to make these Web3 browsers like Opera be able to decipher the URLs. So it's not integrated yet. But for Ethereum namespace, it's the most accepted domain name, blockchain domain name, if you want to call it that, provider at this time.
Now, I'm sure Tom has some perspectives on this. And before Tom speaks, let me just I'm trying to answer the questions in the Q&A. Somebody asked, like, well, why they're asking Alain, and I don't think Alain can speak to this, so I'm going to throw it out for Tom and others. Do you think that ICANN can regulate those all they're calling them alt DNSs, at least for those managed by ICANN and ICANN accredited registrars, right? So if it's an accredited registrar registering kind of, and again, I'm using the term Web3 just for brevity, Web3 domains, can ICANN regulate those? So, and I don't want to make you say whatever you wanted to say before it, Tom.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I'd like to make a few points. I think what you're hearing from Chjango and Giovanna is that the Web3 domain space is they don't all have the same use case, and they're not all approaching their technology in the same way. And so there's a traditional technology adoption life cycle, and we're still in the early phase of that life cycle, where no one has a complete solution yet or a complete ecosystem yet compared to the traditional ICANN namespace. And so the things like there requires manual intervention. Well, that was true in the early days of the internet as well, and that the fact you needed bridging techniques. In fact, it's still ongoing. ICANN still has a universal acceptance group that even 10 years after the last round is finding persistent problems in getting ICANN TLDs to work across their ecosystem. And so this is a never-ending battle for domain names. I certainly think that I'm the chair of the blockchain committee for the International Trademark Association. We see these as emerging brand identifiers that needs to be addressed from a trademark abuse perspective. And so it's not going to be a UDRP because of the way the blockchain, in fact, the constitution of ENS, for example, is name ownership shall not be infringed, right? And so they have a totally different principle about how they will respect IP rights and third-party rights. But we do think there will be a dispute process put in place to protect both trademarks and copyrights across Web3, the decentralized web, and that will help bridge, cross the chasm basically from early adopters into mainstream adoption. I do want to take one issue with Alain's comments earlier, saying that an application can only support one naming service. That's absolutely not true. There are applications out there today, Brave's a great example, that are supporting multiple naming systems today. It only becomes an issue when they start to have colliding top-level domains. But if they're not colliding, then there's no reason why an application, a Chrome or Firefox, is unable to support multiple naming services. So the real issue, real conflict, I think, is the collision issue, which I think we'll get into soon.
Yeah, we'll get into the collision issue soon. I don't know if Alain wants to comment back on that, on Tom's point about multiple.
Well, that actually is the crux of the issue, is that if you connect to multiple places and you have absolutely no way to resolve those collisions, then you actually bring chaos to the party, because the resolution process will be dependent on the order in which those different namespaces will be queried. So you may have one result in one place, another result in another place. And that's not exactly something that will help consumers.
Right. And so this is a recognized problem in the Web3 space. There are two efforts underway right now as we speak. Unstoppable announced one last week called the Web3 Domain Alliance. And there's also a Hedera-based effort called the Decentralized DNS DAO. And DAOs, by the way, stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. It's how blockchains do governance. And there's basically every NFT project out there are going to eventually have a DAO to do governance. And there'll be DAOs that do governance across naming services, across blockchains, to basically allow the industry to cooperate.
Just to give you an idea about how broken DAOs are right now, is they're managed by a multi-signature scheme, which means that, it could be 5 or 10 people at most in those multi-signature groups. And that is arguably more centralized and less process-based, with no accountability to any jurisdiction that regulates them, than anything else that exists in meat space. So that's arguably, moving backwards. So I wouldn't say that that's a panacea. And looking at what Unstoppable Domains has done, it looks like a desperate claw to in the face of losing battle. With their trademark battles.
Yeah, so Unstoppable, I think, hasn't formed a DAO yet. We should acknowledge that. But they've also are suggesting that the solution to collisions is to have trademark rights recognized in these generic strings. So that's not likely to be accepted by the court, and not likely, obviously, it's not accepted by trademark offices today. But DAOs are definitely a fast-moving target. There's a litigation right now called the Uki litigation, where a DAO is being sued by the CFTC, the Commodity Future Trading Commission. And what it's forcing every blockchain project to do is to look, we need a legal entity. This DAO can't simply be a smart contract. It has to be a legal entity, and we have to pick the right jurisdiction for it. And so what you're seeing now are, just as Delaware is a magnet for people who want to incorporate themselves, you see places like the state of Wyoming already has a DAO wrapper. You see Florida and Texas starting to create something called DAO wrappers, the Marshall Islands. And so there's a mad scramble to figure out how do we govern ourselves in a way that also provides a liability shield to the members that are participating in Web3 governance.
And so we're going to get to collisions in a bit. I think Alain has a quick presentation. I want to save, there's a lot of questions, so I want to save some more time for Q&A at the end. But since we're on the topic of like trademark law and copyright law, Giovanna, you're an attorney. This is your bread and butter. Is there any role? I know there's folks registered for this webinar from NTIA, the Department of Commerce, as well as the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. What is legal framework here?
Well, there's the issue of protection, enforcing your rights in the Web3 space, which is very challenging. It's not super clear on, how you might do that with it. It would just because it's there isn't a centralized authority that is controlling, the issuance of the domains, at least for like ENS, for example, the Ethereum name system. And they're not, as Thomas indicated, they're not enforcing, they're not, like Unstoppable has a list of famous marks, and they're not issuing trademarks, they're not issuing domain names for any of the famous marks unless you prove that you have a registration, a trademark registration for that mark. But Ethereum name service it's a free for all. So if you go and try to find, like I've looked to try to find my clients' marks on there, and many of them are already taken. And in fact, many, even famous marks are taken. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's not the trademark owner that has those, that owns those NFT domain tokens. So it's quite a challenge, and it's not exactly clear on how you would enforce your rights in that space. It'd be quite it's challenging, but it's an evolving space. And in terms of registration at the trademark office, I think that I think it's a smart move on the Patent and Trademarks Office to not be issuing trademark registrations on top level domains for Web3, for any top level domain, but in particular for Web3, I think it's helpful. And I understand that Unstoppable has had quite a challenge. They haven't been able, although they might have had some of them allowed, they haven't been able to submit a specimen that would qualify to show use of the mark. So they haven't gotten any registrations in that space. Go ahead.
I think Chjango has a perspective on this, but I'll also note that, again, as Chjango mentioned earlier, and the U.S. Senator Patrick Leahy and Senator Tillis asked the Patent and Trademark Office for, like, can you help kind of do a little more fact finding on what NFTs are and how do they relate to intellectual property. And so that process is ongoing. I think they'll announce in a week or two that whole process. I don't know if it'll take into effect, the domain name issue. And by the way, I have to apologize to everybody in the call for nomenclature, right? I've been using Web3 shorthand. Some people want to hit me with a hatchet when I say Web3 because they don't like that term. And then also when it comes to domain names, I can see through the Q&A that there are probably people on this webinar silently screaming, "Don't call it domain names if it's on a blockchain or Web3." I apologize, but I'm doing shorthand when it comes to some of these things, just to kind of explain the domain of policy issues that we're talking about. And for that matter, the people that are, end-to-end encryption enthusiasts, which we all should be actually. I apologize for calling it crypto. that's supposed to mean end-to-end encryption. So
yeah, well, I have one other thing. Just so trademarks are one issue, but I'm a computer scientist. I'm a patent attorney, and the innovation on the innovation side with NFT domain names, if you want to call it that, but just what the NFT can do. That's a huge space, and there's endless possibilities, and it's very exciting. So in that space, there's a lot of IP to be had, and it's evolving, and it's interesting, and it's exciting, and that's going to be transformative in the next 10, 20 years. About it'll be something that we commonly use, and you won't even it'll just creep up on us, and it'll be part of our daily life that we'll have these kind of NFT domain names, or just NFT. So that's what we use to do business.
So Tim, real quick, you mentioned the USPTO. So the USPTO, as well as the European Union PTO and WIPO, these trademark offices are looking for guidance from folks like the Trademark Association as well as WIPO in terms of how should they regard virtual goods or the metaverse. How should they address concerns about trademarks and trademark abuse with NFTs. And so I'm actually in Miami next week for the INTA leadership meeting, where we're presenting to their board of directors a 100-page NFT white paper that outlines a lot of these issues we're talking about today, but also because it's not just about Web3 domain names, but NFTs in general. And what should the trademark industry be doing to address this sort of concern and threat? And so I do think there will be coming out of this a process to address trademark disputes and cyber squatting on Web3, not just with domain names, but metaverses in general. So the USPTO is looking to help them define what that might look like. And so I think you'll see some developments on that in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, because the environment is so fractured, I could see, like handshake being important in trying to enforce, filter out what's allowed or what's not, or the browsers. I think it's going to put a lot more focus on the technology that is, transmitting the data, the NFT, to be able to apply enforcement, because it might be challenging to do it otherwise. It'll be interesting to figure out how they can actually, implement enforcement, whether it'll be the browser or, a process that is communicating the NFT. I mean, so it's not like we have this universal domain name or NFT domain database that you can go and augment or fix or, block. So,
Alain, do you want to? I promise we kind of talk a little bit about collisions, because all collisions are different, right? In the eye of the beholder. Like some are fender benders, and some are 40-car pileups on Route 95. Do you want to just do some of your slides on kind of explaining what a collision is?
Sure, but just before that, if you allow me for 30 seconds, we have been talking here about patent trademark infringement, but there's another aspect also that we should not forget, which is how to deal with domain name abuse. And that has been a serious problem in the industry, and there are processes that exist today in the ICANN world to deal with that, to how to do takedowns of domains. One of the open questions that is still unresolved now is how will this map into those blockchain names? Because from what I understand, it's actually impossible to remove something from the blockchain. So that will make this task of doing, domain name abuse mitigation a lot more complicated.
Right. And just a quick follow-up to that. So it's not going to look like UDRP, where you can transfer ownership of a digital asset. It'll be more similar to a URS, where there's a takedown and a blacklisting process for DNS abuse and trademark abuse, etc.
So all those are issues that somehow need to be put on the table and discussed by the entire community. That was actually the purpose of my paper, is to steer some discussion on these topics. So I want to talk a little bit about name collision, because sometimes name collision is very abstract and people say, okay, it doesn't really matter. So I want to illustrate with a little cartoon. It's supposed to be humoristic, so bear with me if it's not 100% real. So let's go ahead. That's a story of two characters, John and Sally. And John is kind of a geeky guy and always wants to be on the cutting edge of technology. Sally, his girlfriend, is a little bit more reserved. So John says, oh, I want a new domain name, and I like to use blockchain. It's kind of hot technology now. And he goes to a third character called Market. And Market, can you give me something cool? And Market says, I can sell you John.Kryptonite. Sure. And John's bias. Next slide, please. He goes to his girlfriend, Sally, you can connect with me at John.Kryptonite. She tries this on her computer. It doesn't work. Next slide. Oh, John says, I forgot to tell you. You first need to install this cool web browser. I never heard of it, says Sally. Is that safe? Next, please. And John goes again and found another technology, cool technology to try. This other blockchain, lots of cool stuff there. Goes back to Market. Can I get another domain there? Sure. Market says John.Superblockchain. Next. Of course, John goes back to Sally. Hey, some more new stuff for you. Try John.Superblockchain. And Sally is say, John, I did install your special browser. You told me last time, but it doesn't work with your new domain? Question mark. Next. Oh, Sally, I forgot to tell you, this is yet another blockchain, so you need to install this other browser and this other plugin to go away. Next. And a bit later, she comes back because she really likes John. John, I've actually followed all the steps you gave me, and I can see you on this super blockchain. But when I try John.Kryptonite now, I see my ex-boyfriend profile. That's not good. What? I don't know anything. It's showing a cell phone. That's me. No, that's you. Big fight. Next. And John goes to Market and says, Sally is very unhappy. She sees different things when she types John.Kryptonite than I do. And Market says, what? That's name collision for you. Kryptonite is very popular. It's available on at least 3 different blockchains. Your computer is not set up the same way as Sally. So you look in one namespace, you look in another. No wonder you see different things. Next. But how come it's not unique? Well, nobody guarantees this is unique. That's the point. Actually, John.Kryptonite is available in a 3rd blockchain. Do you want to buy it, or should I sell it to Sally's ex-boyfriend? Next, please. And John says, this is really, really stupid. I want to go back to my old John.ICANN domain. At least that one was unique. And Market, no, you can't escape name collision. See, this .ICANN is now available in 5 different alternative naming systems. Maybe you can create your own alternative naming systems. And John says, Market, you're a monster. The internet is now completely broken. So thank you for allowing me this little touch of humor to illustrate why name collision is an important problem and can affect everybody, not just people buying the domains.
So if I could just jump in.
Doesn't everybody feel bad for John? And he's not going to get Sally. I mean, poor guy.
So it was interesting, just as there's a debate in the chat about, don't call these domain names. That's a big mistake. So the real question is you also have to define collisions as well. And so I'm involved in the ICANN, name collision advisory process. And the method of a collision is there error traffic going to the root servers? And it's not clear that blockchain-based collisions are causing error traffic to the root servers or even any traffic to the traditional DNS. And so it's an interesting, it pretty much expands the definition of collisions into areas that has not yet been studied in terms of how do we analyze and assess how much of these collisions are happening in the traditional DNS? How do we measure those collisions? There's another round coming up. How do we assess potential consumer harm to introducing a new ICANN TLD if we don't see this collision at the root server? So it opens up a whole set of questions that have yet to be explored that will be interesting in the next few years.
So actually, Tom, we could see some of those at the root because things leak, and they're supposed to be in an isolated ecosystem, but actually they leak out in different parts of the world. And we do see some indirect traces of that at the root. So it's not a perfect measurement, and I agree with you. That's a topic that in more research, in my group, we have started some research on this very, very question, but we do see some of those things.
And one thing I want to drill down a little bit about is Tom opened the door to discussion of abuse. So we do a lot of work in the kind of trust and safety field, right? So when it comes to abuse, whether it be copyright infringement, whether it be child sexual exploitation images, when it comes to just general types of abuse, that is really at the heart of like a lot of the conversations that we're having today about Section 230 and about things like that. What is the abuse resolution system going to be for this new domain space or addressing system? And when it comes to trust and safety, as we call it, or abuse resolution, there's different responsibilities at different levels of the stack, right? And the DNS or the root is kind of the base of the stack, and then you go up to like Cloudflare and other levels up to the stack to the services that have social media and things like that. But what is the abuse resolution system for this new space going to be?
I think it's going to be similar to what we have today. You have multiple groups that will identify websites and addresses that are abused. They're doing phishing, farming, trademark abuse, cyber squatting, child sex abuse. And they develop blacklists that then the ecosystem starts to pay attention to and follow, so they can provide a rich user experience for end users. And I think that you'll see Web3 start to adopt many of those same blacklists in their ecosystem. Because again, they all want to provide a rich user experience. They want brands to adopt. The venture capitalists are motivated to make sure that they have an exit, so they need adoption. And so I think you'll see voluntary adoption of all the multiple blacklists that are targeting different types of abuse.
And for the Department of Justice officials on this webinar, what does the response to law enforcement look like?
Well, I think as we're seeing with this CFTC, you'll be able to go after. No one's unreachable, right? They're finding folks who have stolen or laundered Bitcoin. Nothing is truly decentralized, and if you can't find the actual culprit, they'll go after the ecosystem itself. They'll go after Cloudflare. They'll go after Chrome, and they'll insist that they enforce the law.
So yeah, just to add some color to that, there's a difference between the cash grab projects, which are centralized, most likely. Like if you look at Unstoppable, they're a company, a corporation, and you could enforce the law over them just like you would enforce it over anyone else. But then there's this other side of the spectrum in this space where there's a high emphasis on decentralization. And if you look at every part of the stack and what its application is addressing, and how its governance works out, it is actually fundamentally decentralized. So when you look at Bitcoin compared to other alternative coins, there's a big difference, right? There's a reason why OFAC is able to sanction Ethereum and not Bitcoin. So understanding those nuances.
By the way, Chjango, OFAC was an acronym I had forgotten from 20 years ago. Can you explain what OFAC is?
Yeah, OFAC is, I forgot the acronym. Office of the I don't remember what the acronym stands for right now. But it's the office that imposes sanctions on sanctioned countries, and if you violate those sanctions, then you're by definition a terrorist. So North Korea, Russia, these are sanctioned countries, Venezuela, and because of geopolitics. So in the recent precedent, OFAC has added certain Ethereum addresses to its list so that validators on chain, validators meaning people who are basically able to append to this blockchain, and that is a permission right. Only validators can do that. So not everybody can read and write to the blockchain. Validators are the service providers that do that, same way as miners do for Bitcoin. Reason for that is because Ethereum has now arguably become more centralized, and there's a lot more centralization choke points that regulators can come in and enforce. And they can't do that on Bitcoin. So understanding that nuance is key. So with Handshake, it's the same thing. It's same governance model, same decentralization. It's a permissionless network, but in order to append to it, you need to expend hash power. And if you try to apply this lens to any other Web3 domaining project, you can't. So, you know, there's a company behind Unstoppable. There's a company behind ENS. If anyone wanted to come and subpoena them and try to stop them in their tracks, they can't. But if you try to apply that same logic to Handshake, you can't. Same way as why governments can't like subpoena miners on Bitcoin and try to impose OFAC sanctions and have them censor specific addresses on the Bitcoin blockchain. You just can't do it by the structural nature of those blockchains. So there's a nuance there. You know, also on the, you know, centralization point, if you ask certain subsectors of the crypto industry, people really want to, some people really want to radically decentralize. So there's a difference between can't be evil and won't be evil. You know, on Handshake, you can't be evil. But, you know, on other naming projects, they claim they won't, but they totally can. So therein lies the difference as well. So that's something important to keep in mind.
Well, I think we're out of time, and there's so much more we could do, and I hate to cut it short, but I promised everybody it would be an hour. So this has been fascinating. Again, we're just for the Decentralized Future Council. We're just trying to kind of lay down some foundational discussions about emerging policy in the decentralized web and kind of connecting it to internet policy in Web 2.0. I mean, I think in the 1990s and 1998, you had the Clinton administration come out with their green paper about the domain name system, and that was hugely influential on bringing people together into a multi-stakeholder perspective. I don't know if there'll be something like that for the decentralized web. I have no idea, but these things happened early, and you know, in 1998, a lot of people weren't paying attention to what was going on, but somebody in the Clinton administration was, and that'll happen here in Washington too. So I'd like to thank everybody. Chjango for, you know, representing the decentralized community has been great, and getting up really early to start your day. Alain, thank you for, you know, beaming in from France where you're ending your day. And Giovanna and Tom for coming from beautiful Massachusetts. This has been a great conversation. We're gonna put this on YouTube and chop this up and put out a transcript. So this has been fascinating. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Tim, for hosting. I think these conversations are really important for both sides to understand each other a lot better. Clearly, this is a multi-year process, so I would love to continue this on as a series if you would.
It'd be great.
To oblige.
Yeah, enthusiastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.